There is a seductive comfort in believing that the absurd is harmless. It allows us to laugh things off, to assume that when political rhetoric drifts into the surreal, it can be safely ignored as noise, provocation, or theatrical exaggeration. Many people experienced that comfort recently when headlines emerged suggesting that Donald Trump had expressed interest in purchasing or even annexing Greenland. The idea felt ridiculous on its face, so out of step with modern politics that it seemed impossible to take seriously. It sounded like something pulled from a distant century, a relic of 19th century imperial bargaining, rather than a legitimate 21st century policy discussion. To many, it resembled a real estate developer's fantasy, projected onto a global graph. Politics, a soundbite designed for attention rather than action. It felt like a punchline, not a plan, and laughter became the natural response. But this is precisely where the danger lies. The instinct to laugh, to dismiss, to wave it away as a joke is not harmless. It is blinding. Because beneath the absurdity, something far more serious is happening. We are living through a moment in which one of the most foundational principles of the post-World War II international system is being quietly eroded. The idea that sovereign borders are inviolable. What appears at first glance to be erratic rhetoric or political theatre is, in fact, a signal. It signals a shift in how power is exercised and justified. The rules that have governed international stability for decades, rules that allowed countries like Canada to thrive without fear of conquest, are no longer being treated as fixed. They're being tested, bent, and rewritten through unilateral assertion rather than collective agreement. This moment did not emerge out of thin air. If the discussion of Greenland stood alone, it could be dismissed as eccentricity. But it does not stand alone. It came immediately after a week in which the United States authorized military strikes in Venezuela and oversaw the capture of its leader. That action demonstrated something critical, a willingness to use direct force to reshape the political reality of a like sovereign nation. When the actions in Venezuela are placed alongside the rhetoric surrounding Greenland, a disturbing pattern becomes visible. This is not about isolated decisions. It reflects a broader movement away from diplomacy, alliances, and multilateral restraint, and toward a worldview based on transactions, leverage, and coercion. Power is no longer something to be coordinated. It is something to be imposed. For years, many citizens took comfort in the belief that extreme rhetoric would be neutralized by institutional guardrails. We assumed that presidents could talk recklessly, but that systems, norms, and allies would restrain their most dangerous impulses. That assumption is now cracking. We are being forced to confront a sobering truth. The unthinkable is no longer unimaginable. It is simply unfinished. This realization explains the urgency of the diplomacy that unfolded in Europe. Images of Prime Minister Mark Carney in Paris may have looked routine, but they were anything but. Behind the polished press conferences and carefully worded statements were emergency discussions driven by genuine alarm. Capitals across the Western world understood that something fundamental was at stake. Carney understands what many voters have not yet fully processed. If the United States can openly entertain the idea of annexing a NATO territory like Greenland, protected by international law and critical to Arctic security, then the entire concept of a guaranteed alliance collapses. Canada's security, once considered automatic, becomes conditional. And in geopolitics, conditional security is indistinguishable from insecurity. Greenland is not a distant or abstract issue for Canada. It is geographically, strategically, and politically close. Canada shares the Arctic, shares responsibility for northern defense, and shares an immense maritime boundary with Greenland. When Greenland's sovereignty is questioned, Canada's own Arctic sovereignty is indirectly placed on the table as well. This is why Carney's language in Europe departed from traditional diplomatic politeness. He was not merely expressing solidarity with Denmark, he was drawing a defensive perimeter around Canada itself. He was asserting a principle that should be self-evident, but now must be stated plainly. The future of a territory belongs to its people, not to the ambitions or strategic calculations of a foreign power. Behind the headlines, governments were not laughing, they were mobilizing. Carney worked to align Canada with European partners to send a unified signal that annexation is not negotiable. NATO, he reminded the world, is a mutual defense alliance, not a commercial marketplace where land can be bought, traded, or absorbed at will. The greatest threat in moments like this is normalization. Once abnormal behavior becomes familiar, resistance weakens. Accept the premise that powerful states may absorb smaller ones for convenience, and the world slides back into a brutal historical logic where strength replaces law. For a middle power like Canada, which depends on international rules rather than military dominance, that world is existentially dangerous. This crisis is not solely about geography, it is also about energy. History shows that the pursuit of resources has driven more conflict than ideology ever has. The actions in Venezuela and the rhetoric surrounding Greenland reveal a return to a mercantilist worldview where states believe they must physically seize assets to guarantee prosperity. It is imperial thinking, dressed up as economic necessity. Carney's response to this worldview was subtle and strategic. Rather than denouncing aggression with emotional language, he reframed the entire argument. He pointed out that energy security does not require invasion or annexation, because a stable alternative already exists. Canadian energy, he emphasized, is competitive not just in price, but in political reliability and governance. This was not merely an economic claim, it was a geopolitical one. By contrasting energy obtained through conflict with energy produced under the rule of law, Carney positioned Canada as a stabilizing force in a destabilized world. Infrastructure projects, often framed as domestic disputes, were elevated into instruments of global security. Standing alongside NATO leadership, Carney reinforced the message that Canada's Arctic role, energy capacity, and alliance commitments are inseparable. The symbolism mattered. Canada was presenting itself as integrated, dependable, and resolute, a pillar rather than a bystander. There is a profound irony in all of this. A leader who prides himself on deal-making is undermining the very stability that makes long-term prosperity possible. Meanwhile, a technocratic prime minister is demonstrating that the rule of law is not a side weakness, but a strategic advantage. The consequences of this moment extend far beyond Greenland or Venezuela. In geopolitics, bad behavior spreads. When borders are treated as suggestions, every nation becomes less secure. Moral authority is not decorative. It is a form of power. Once abandoned, it cannot be easily recovered. We must also remember the human reality beneath these abstractions. Greenland is not an empty map. It is home to real people, real communities, and real histories. Sovereignty is not about lines. It is about dignity, consent, and self-determination. Ultimately, this moment represents a clash between two visions of the world. One sees everything as transactional, and the symbolism mattered. Canada was presenting itself as integrated, dependable, and resolute. A pillar rather than a bystander. There is a profound irony in all of this. A leader who prides himself on deal-making is undermining the very stability that makes long-term prosperity possible. Meanwhile, a technocratic prime minister is demonstrating that the rule of law is not a weakness, but a strategic advantage. The consequences of this moment extend far beyond Greenland or Venezuela. In geopolitics, bad behavior spreads. When borders are treated as suggestions, every nation becomes less secure. Moral authority is not decorative. It is a form of power. Once abandoned, it cannot be easily recovered. We must also remember the human reality beneath these abstractions. Greenland is not an empty map. It is home to real people, real communities, and real histories. Sovereignty is not about lines, it is about dignity, consent, and self-determination. Ultimately, this moment represents a clash between two visions of the world. One sees everything as transactional and temporary. The other believes in institutions, agreements, and collective responsibility. One promises dominance but produces instability. The other lacks spectacle but delivers endurance. The crisis over Greenland is not an isolated episode. It is part of a changing global climate. Canada can no longer rely on distance or complacency for protection. What remains are alliances, resolve, and clarity. A line has been drawn in the ice. Whether it holds depends on whether we choose to defend it.